was president during the 80s.
Well, the time has come. You've seen the map. We've looked at the figures, and NBC News now makes its projection for the presidency. Reagan is our projected winner. Ronald Wilson Reagan of California, a sports announcer, a film actor, a governor of California, is our projected winner at 8:15 Eastern Standard Time. On this election night, we have projected Ronald Reagan the winner. And
you know about the Cold War and his part in it?
His part? Pretty much just like build up the army in case we gotta fight.
Do you know who we were fighting against?
Technically the Russians, communists in general.
In the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan implemented a strategy called the Reagan Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine goes on the offensive, upholding liberation with the goal of trying to recover communist-controlled land for freedom. It was a strategy orchestrated and implemented by the United States under the Reagan administration to overwhelm the global influence of the Soviet Union in an attempt to end the Cold War. The doctrine was the centerpiece of United States foreign policy from the early 1980s until the end of the Cold War. On March 30th, 1981, an assassination attempt was taken on President Ronald Reagan's life. Reagan and 3 others were shot and wounded by John Hinckley Jr. in Washington, D.C. as they were leaving Washington Hilton Hotel. Hinckley's motivation for the attack was to impress actress Jodie Foster, whom he had developed an obsession with after seeing her in the 1976 film Taxi Driver. There were no immediate fatalities in the aftermath of the attack. Reagan was shot in the chest just below the left armpit. He suffered a punctured lung and heavy internal bleeding, but prompt medical attention allowed him to make a speedy recovery.
I heard a noise and we came out of the hotel and headed for the limousine, and I heard some noise and I thought it was firecrackers. And the next thing I knew, one of the Secret Service agents behind me just seized me here by the waist and plunged me headfirst into the limo. I landed on the seat and the seat divider was down, and then he dived in on top of me, which is part of their procedure to make sure that I'm covered. Well, as it turned out later, the shot that got me caromed off the side of the limousine and hit me while I was diving into the car. And it hit me back here under the arm and then hit a rib. And that's what caused an extreme pain.
How do you think our economy was during the 1980s?
I think it was pretty solid.
Pretty solid?
I'm pretty sure it's decent.
Do you know how much debt we are in today?
No idea, man. I want to say somewhere in the billions, maybe.
President Reagan introduced Reaganomics in response to a long period of economic stagflation. He did so with the goal of reducing domestic spending, reducing taxes on individuals and businesses, reducing regulation of business, and supported slowed money growth in the economy. Although analysts argue over the success of Reaganomics, it did precede one of the longest periods of prosperity in American history, reducing unemployment below 6%. In 1985, the U.S. also became the world's largest debtor nation since World War I, and is still currently with a debt of over $20 trillion.
The moral standards in the culture of relativism in the 1980s were high. The discovery of AIDS was what originated homophobia during this time, since homosexuals were the group that was most affected by AIDS. However, the issue became a social crisis, which almost obligated the government to give funds for research on the cure of AIDS. What also contributed to the high moral standards was the first female judge, Sandra Day O'Connor, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan in 1981. Her place in the Supreme Court justice promoted equality between men and women. The feeling of society in America in the 1980s was positive overall.
For the presidency, I made a commitment that one of my first appointments to the Supreme Court vacancy would be the most qualified woman that I could possibly find. Now, this is not to say that I would appoint a woman merely to do so. That would not be fair to women, nor to future generations of all Americans whose lives are so deeply affected by decisions of the court. Rather, I pledge to appoint a woman who meets the very high standards that I demand of all court appointees. I have identified such a person. So today, I'm pleased to announce that upon completion of all the necessary checks by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona Court of Appeals for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
Do you know the first African American artist that had ever achieved the highest level of success in the 1980s?
I don't know. I'm gonna say. I'll say Booker T. Washington.
What? Okay. Do you know of any video game systems in the 1980s?
Video game systems. Nintendo.
Now, let's talk about culture. First of all, who hasn't heard of the greatest entertainer of all time? I know I have. His name is Michael Jackson, aka the King of Pop, whose greatest contribution to the world was his humanitarianism by sponsoring charities and helping people, like children, to understand races of all color who deserve a chance at life and have the same opportunities as anyone else. In addition, Michael helped society be more accepting of idols of color in pop culture, making it a major milestone. However, without his music, so many other idols of color, like Lil Wayne, Beyonce, The Weeknd, wouldn't have been inspired or be who they are today. Furthermore, Michael expressed his creativity in a way that helped unite the world and have so many races, ethnicities, and cultures come together, not only in the 1980s, but in our time today. Also, in 1985, Coke released New Coke in response to losing round to its rival Pepsi, partially due to Michael's endorsement. Additionally, in the mid-1980s, video game systems such as Nintendo and Atari were introduced, keeping society together by having them play and interact with one another, later making Atari and Nintendo as one of the greatest video consoles in history.
You're a whole new generation. You're loving what I do. I put a Pepsi in the motion, but that's just up to you. Hey, you're the Pepsi generation. Girls are down and there's the thrill of the day.
With famous artist Andy Warhol during the 1980s, what would you say would be his feelings towards the era?
I believe he was depressed during that era because he was friends with Basquiat and he committed suicide. Therefore, he's just very depressed and that's it.
Andy Warhol had a very creative mind, yet it was also unorthodox. This issued an era of out-box thinking among artists. Usually, artists will be painting landscapes or by the book. Andy Warhol broke that pattern and tradition and substituted with a creative, outspoken mentality. This was brought out through all his works, even though there was times where he had trouble himself in life. He still creatively and impressively was able to pull through.
Your work tends to be, I don't want to use the word sensational because that connotes something bad, but you want attention.
Oh no, that's not true. I work most of the time, and then I just have. Well, they make me do this, so.
You want them, those who buy your work, to keep it and study it and live with it,
and then sell it,
resell it.
Yes.
Why?
Well, it's like everything else. I think everything else should be recycled, like leftover. Food at restaurants.
Well, that's your concept. That's the Andy Warhol touch that makes it different.
Well, that's what I sort of believe in.